My brother didn't just steal from our grandfather. He stole 3 years of my life, and he did it while sitting in the front row at my sentencing, dabbing at dry eyes with a folded handkerchief. I can still hear Judge Carroll's voice in the moment before everything changed. A single word, guilty. I turned and looked at my brother Garrett. He had his hand on his wife Nicole's shoulder. Neither of them would look at me. At the time, I told myself that meant they were ashamed, that they couldn't face what had happened to me. It took me almost 3 years inside a federal corrections facility to understand that what I had seen in their posture wasn't shame at all. It was relief. My name is Avery Marsh, and until I was 31 years old, I believed that blood meant something, that family meant something. My grandfather, Harold Marsh, had spent 40 years building a commercial property management company out of nothing. He started with a single duplex in Knoxville and worked every day for 4 decades until his company managed more than 60 properties across East Tennessee. By the time his health started to fail, his estate was worth close to $4 million. Everyone in the family knew eventually that money would have to go somewhere. Nobody talked about it out loud, but everybody thought about it constantly. I know my brother did. During the last 2 years of my grandfather's life, he asked me to help him organize things. He was 81 years old and managing a Parkinson's diagnosis on top of the normal slowing that comes with age. He trusted me. I was the one who drove him to his appointments at the University of Tennessee Medical Center. I was the one who sat beside him when his physician, Dr. Callahan, explained what to expect as the disease progressed. I organized his medication schedule. I filed his paperwork. I thought I was simply doing what family is supposed to do. My grandfather passed away on a Thursday morning in March. We buried him that Saturday with a graveside service that drew people I hadn't seen since I was a child. My brother Garrett gave the eulogy. He cried in a way that made every single person in that cemetery reach for a tissue. I stood 3 feet away from him and felt proud that my family could hold each other up in a moment like that. I had no idea that Garrett had spent the previous 6 months carefully building a trap with my name on it. 11 days after the funeral, my grandfather's estate attorney called me in for a meeting. She informed me that her preliminary accounting had identified a serious discrepancy. According to her records, roughly $900,000 had been withdrawn from my grandfather's trust account in a series of transactions over the prior 8 months. The withdrawals were authorized with signatures that matched mine. They were accompanied by notarized documents transferring funds into a private account that investigators would later claim had been opened in my name. 2 days after that meeting, I was arrested in the parking lot of the physical therapy clinic where I had worked for 6 years. The detectives who processed me were professional, calm. They explained the charges in the flat, practiced tone of people who had done this hundreds of times. Elder financial abuse, theft by deception, fraud. I kept interrupting to tell them there had been a mistake, and they kept nodding in the polite, distant way that made it clear they had already made up their minds. By the time I called my boyfriend Ryan from a holding cell, I had stopped trying to explain. I just needed him to know where I was. The arraignment was the first time I saw my brother since the funeral. He sat in the gallery with Nicole beside him, both dressed like they were attending a church service. After the hearing, outside on the courthouse steps, Garrett told me he was sorry for what I had done. He didn't say he was sorry it had happened to me. He said he was sorry for what I had done. I stood there in the afternoon sun, trying to process the difference between those 2 sentences, and I couldn't find the words to respond before he turned and walked away. My attorney entered a not guilty plea, and we began preparing for trial. I spent those weeks going through every document I could remember touching in my grandfather's house, trying to reconstruct a timeline that would show where I had been and what I had handled. The problem was that I had handled everything. That was the whole reason my grandfather had trusted me with it. Garrett's attorney used that fact to devastating effect during depositions. When the trial began, the prosecution built their case on 3 things: the withdrawal documents bearing my signature, the account records showing funds transferred into an account linked to my identifying information, and the testimony of my brother. Garrett took the stand on the 3rd day. He was composed, careful, and heartbreaking in a way that I could only watch with a kind of sick amazement. He told the jury that he had noticed me becoming more interested in our grandfather's financial affairs during the final year of his life. He said he had found that unusual because finances had never been something I paid much attention to before. He said he had mentioned his concern to Nicole, But he hadn't wanted to accuse his own sister without proof. His voice stayed even and measured the entire time as though he had rehearsed the cadence down to the pauses. Nicole followed him. She testified that she had once walked into my grandfather's study and found me photographing documents on my phone. I had no memory of ever doing that. When my attorney cross-examined her, she held to her story without flinching. She looked directly at the jury. She looked exactly like a person telling the truth. I took the stand and told my side as clearly as I could. I explained every document I had touched and why. I explained the medication schedule and the filing system I had created, and the reason my grandfather's financial files were kept in the cabinet beside his medical records. I told the jury I had never opened a separate financial account in my life, and certainly not one linked to my grandfather's trust. My attorney argued that the signatures were forged and that the notarizations were fraudulent. The prosecution's handwriting expert disagreed. Their forensic accountant testified that the account linked to my name showed activity consistent with intentional concealment. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. When the foreperson read the verdict, I looked at the gallery one final time. Garrett had his arm around Nicole. They were both looking down at the floor. As the judge addressed me and the bailiff moved toward my side of the room, I saw my brother lift his face for just a moment. He caught my eye, and then he nodded at me to himself. A single small nod, like someone confirming something they had already known for a very long time. I thought about that nod every single day for 3 years. The first months inside the Bledsoe County Correctional Complex were the worst, not because of anything that happened inside the facility itself, but because of how the world outside went completely silent. Ryan's letters arrived steadily through the first 6 weeks. Then they became shorter. Then they stopped entirely. He called the facility once in October and told me, in a voice that was more exhausted than cruel, that he had accepted a position in Portland. He said he hoped things worked out for me. He said it the way people say it when they already know they won't be around to find out. My coworkers from the clinic sent a card in the early weeks. A handful of my closer friends wrote letters during the first year. By the second year, the letters had thinned to almost nothing. The world had a version of me that it had already decided on, and most people in my life found it easier to accept that version than to keep questioning it out loud. The only person who kept asking questions was Dr. Callahan. I didn't know he was doing it at the time. I found out later that he had started reviewing the estate timeline on his own, about 4 months after my conviction, working through it the way he might work through an unusual set of symptoms, methodically, without rushing to conclusions, keeping notes. He told me later that 2 things had bothered him from the very beginning. The first was the timing. Several of the largest withdrawals had occurred on days when my grandfather was either in the hospital or in Dr. Callahan's office for extended appointments. On those days, I was either sitting in a waiting room or clocked in at work. The prosecution had argued the transactions could have been initiated remotely, and technically that was possible. But Dr. Callahan had spent 22 years as my grandfather's physician. He knew how my grandfather structured his weeks. He knew my grandfather had kept private notebooks for decades, not medical records, but personal journals where he documented decisions, meetings, concerns, and conversations. Those journals had never appeared during the investigation. Nobody had explained where they went. The second thing that bothered him was a conversation he'd had with my grandfather about 8 months before the old man died. My grandfather had mentioned, during a routine appointment, that he was having what he called some friction with Garrett over the estate plan. He said my brother had begun asking detailed questions about the trust structure that went beyond what my grandfather considered natural curiosity. He said he felt pressured. He didn't say more than that, and Dr. Callahan hadn't pressed him at the time. He told me later he wished 1,000 times that he had. About 16 months after my conviction, a manila envelope arrived at Dr. Callahan's office through regular mail. There was no return address on it. Inside was a single photocopied page in my grandfather's handwriting. It appeared to have been torn from one of his journals. Most of it covered routine property matters. Near the bottom, one short paragraph had been circled in red pen by whoever had sent the copy. The paragraph read, "If I don't get the trust documents updated before anything happens to me, make sure Avery doesn't sign anything related to the estate without someone trustworthy in the room. Garrett has been asking about the Morristown account specifically. I don't like it." Dr. Callahan made no assumptions from that single page. He didn't go to the police with it. Instead, he went back through the records he had legitimate access to: appointment logs, discharge notes, anything that could help him establish where my grandfather had actually been on the days those withdrawals occurred. He sent a formal written request to the estate attorney, asking to review copies of the original withdrawal authorization documents for his own medical files. The estate attorney declined, but noted in writing that the request had been made. He kept looking anyway. Before my grandfather's estate had been fully settled, several boxes of old files from the property management company had been placed in a commercial storage warehouse. The estate attorney had flagged them as low priority, mostly outdated leases, correspondence, and administrative records from the earliest years of the business. They were scheduled for secure disposal. Dr. Callahan asked to review them before that happened. The estate attorney, who had her own quiet doubts about how the investigation had been conducted, agreed to give him access. It took him 2 full afternoons to work through the boxes. Most of what he found was exactly what the estate description said it would be: records from 30 years ago, carbon copy receipts, correspondence so old the ink had faded to pale gray. Then, in the 4th box, he found something that didn't belong. Tucked inside a manila folder, labeled Miscellaneous 1987-1991, was a hardcover medical reference book. My grandfather had gifted Dr. Callahan a copy of that same title at Christmas years before. This copy was different. The interior pages had been carefully hollowed out to create a small compartment in the center. Inside the compartment was a sealed plastic bag. Inside the bag was a USB drive. Dr. Callahan has told me since that his hands were completely steady when he plugged it in. He said he had been in medicine long enough that he knew how to hold himself together until a diagnosis was confirmed. The drive contained 3 folders. The first folder held video files. My grandfather had recorded himself on his phone, 12 separate recordings, made over the span of about 5 months. He sat at his kitchen table for most of them, sometimes in the recliner in his study. In every recording, he spoke directly into the camera, in the clear, deliberate voice he had, before the Parkinson's progressed far enough to affect his speech. He documented Garrett's increasing interest in the Morristown accounts. He recorded specific conversations by date: what was said, who else had been present, where they were sitting. In one recording, he described a visit from my brother and Nicole during which Garrett had brought a document and asked him to sign it for what he called tax purposes. My grandfather said the document was a power of attorney authorization that had not been drafted by his estate attorney, and that he did not recognize the notary listed at the bottom. He said he refused to sign it. He said he was recording everything because he didn't trust what might happen after he was gone. The second folder contained scanned copies of his private journals, the same journals that had disappeared from his home after his death. Page after page of his careful handwriting, including the months immediately before he passed. The entries documented the pressure from Garrett in detail. Conversations my grandfather had attempted to have with the estate attorney about updating the trust, and his growing suspicion that something was being arranged without his knowledge or consent. The third folder contained something that made the whole picture come together at once. Side-by-side comparisons of documents. On the left, original paperwork my grandfather had signed in Dr. Callahan's office over the years, routine forms bearing his genuine signature and in several places, mine. On the right, the withdrawal authorizations that had been entered into evidence at my trial. My grandfather had somehow obtained copies of those documents before his death. He had placed them side by side and photographed each pair. Even on a small screen, the differences became visible once you knew exactly where to look. The letter spacing on the forged signatures was too even, too controlled, missing the natural micro-variations of handwriting produced without thought. The pen pressure was inconsistent with the way either of us actually wrote. My grandfather had known what was coming, and he had done everything he could to leave a trail. Dr. Callahan didn't go to the media. He went to a criminal defense attorney he trusted, and together they filed an emergency motion to reopen my case. The court granted a preliminary hearing. Independent forensic document examiners were brought in to analyze both sets of signatures. Their findings aligned with what my grandfather had photographed. The signatures used to convict me did not match my authentic handwriting at the level of fine motor characteristics. They had been produced by someone with considerable skill, but they had not been produced by me. At the same time, a separate financial investigator began retracing the account activity that had been presented at trial. Following the money forward from the original trust withdrawals, They identified a series of transfers that had passed through a single-member LLC registered in Georgia. The LLC had been formed 14 months before my grandfather's death. The registered agent was a business associate of my brother's, who had worked on several side projects with Garrett over the years. From that entity, the funds had moved into two accounts, one held jointly by Garrett and Nicole, and one held by a second shell company that existed only on paper. Every transaction had a date. Every date had a corresponding entry in my grandfather's journal. It took 6 more weeks for the full picture to be assembled into something the court could formally act on. During that time, investigators served my brother with a notice that new evidence had come forward and that the criminal case connected to my conviction was under review. According to what I was told afterward, Garrett's response to receiving that notice was to call a real estate agent. He and Nicole listed one of the properties they had received from my grandfather's estate for a fast sale. They had already purchased plane tickets to Costa Rica. What they hadn't anticipated was that the court had placed a freeze on any asset transfers connected to the estate. During the same week, the review motion was filed. When my brother and Nicole arrived at the title company to sign the closing documents on that property, federal agents were already waiting inside the conference room. I was sitting on my bunk on a Tuesday morning when a corrections officer came to tell me I had a legal call. My attorney's voice on the phone was careful and professional, but I could hear something underneath it that I hadn't heard in her voice in a long time. She told me the arrest had happened. She told me the words I had spent 3 years trying not to stop believing I would ever hear. The conviction review was proceeding, and based on the evidence now before the court, my release pending the final hearing was being recommended. 3 days later, I walked out of that facility carrying everything I still owned in a canvas tote bag. The world outside was louder than I expected. Not physically loud, just full. Colors seemed more saturated than I remembered. I stood in the parking lot for a while before I got into my attorney's car, just breathing outside air and trying to understand what it felt like to be standing on ordinary ground again. The final hearing took place 6 weeks after my release. The courtroom was fuller than I had anticipated. Dr. Callahan sat near the front of the gallery. My attorney presented the forensic findings, the financial investigation, the video recordings, and the journal entries in a sequence that was methodical, and, by the time it concluded, impossible to argue around. The prosecution's original case had depended on the assumption that the investigation had been thorough. What became clear in that hearing was that critical financial records had been available during the original case and had not been pulled. Records that would have raised immediate questions about the Shell LLC and where the money had actually traveled. The judge presiding over the review hearing noted that failure specifically in her written order. She did not call it misconduct from the bench, but the district attorney's office later opened an internal review of how the original prosecution had been conducted, and the lead prosecutor was placed on administrative review during that process. That hadn't been enough for some people in the gallery, and honestly, it wasn't entirely enough for me either. But it was something. It was the system for once, turning its attention back toward itself. When the judge looked at me before reading her conclusion, she held my eyes for a moment that felt longer than it actually was. Then she said, "Based on the totality of the evidence now before this court, the original conviction is vacated. The record will reflect that Avery Marsh is factually innocent of all charges brought against her." Garrett and Nicole were convicted on 8 federal counts, including elder financial abuse, fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Their attorney argued for reduced sentences based on no prior criminal record. The judge cited the deliberate nature of what they had done. The months of planning before my grandfather died, the creation of a legal entity specifically designed to move stolen money without detection, the decision to allow an innocent person to serve a prison term rather than come forward, and declined to reduce either sentence. Garrett received 9 years. Nicole received 7. I was in the courtroom when the sentences were read. I didn't say a word. When they were let out, Nicole glanced back once toward the gallery, toward no one in particular. My brother looked straight ahead. I thought about the small nod he had given himself at my own sentencing, that private confirmation that the plan had worked. I wondered if he had made any plan for this moment. Standing there, watching the door close behind him, I was fairly certain he hadn't. A civil judgment returned a significant portion of the stolen inheritance to me, along with damages for the wrongful conviction. I spent the weeks after everything was finalized in a kind of slow adjustment, relearning what an ordinary morning felt like. Some of my friends reached out. A few of them admitted they had never really believed I was guilty, but hadn't known what to do with that belief when the headlines were going the other direction. Some of them cried when we talked. I listened to all of it. I didn't close every door, but I didn't pretend that 3 years of silence hadn't happened either. Forgiveness and trust, I had learned, were not the same thing. You could let go of your anger without handing someone back the key. I used a portion of the settlement to establish a small fund through a legal aid nonprofit based in Knoxville. The fund provides financial support for elderly individuals across Tennessee who have been targeted by financial exploitation from family members, covering legal fees, investigative costs, and emergency protective services when families can't afford them on their own. I called it the Harold Marsh Fund. It felt like the only right name. It felt like something he would have understood immediately. There was one place I still hadn't gone. One thing I had been quietly putting off without fully admitting to myself that I was doing it. On a Saturday morning in November, I drove to the cemetery where my grandfather was buried. The air was sharp and cool, and the leaves had mostly come down from the oaks that lined the main path. I walked the same route I had walked at his funeral 8 years ago, though it felt like 2 different lifetimes ago now, and found his headstone without any trouble. I set down the small bunch of white carnations I had brought. They had been his favorite, the kind he used to buy fresh every week and put in a glass jar on the kitchen table, right next to his coffee and his newspaper. I crouched in the grass beside the stone and stayed there for a long time without speaking. I wasn't sure what I wanted to say. I had rehearsed things on the drive over, and none of them felt right once I was actually there. I thought about everything he had done in those final months, sitting alone at his kitchen table, recording himself on his phone, writing in those journals, knowing that someone might try to make them disappear, hiding that USB drive inside a book he had given to the one person he trusted completely, in a box he knew would eventually make its way into storage. He had done all of that while managing a disease that was slowly taking away his steadiness, his certainty, his grip on the finer details of his own days. He had done it quietly, without telling anyone, because he believed that the truth needed a way to survive even if he didn't. Eventually, I found the words. They weren't the ones I had planned. I told him I was sorry it had happened the way it did. I told him I was sorry that the people he had worked his whole life to provide for had looked at everything he built and seen nothing but an opportunity. I told him that what he had left on that drive had saved me, and that I wanted him to know his name was still out in the world, attached to something decent now. Something that would help people who had nobody else willing to fight for them. I don't know how long I stayed beside the headstone, long enough that the sun shifted and the shadows moved across the grass in a slow diagonal. When I finally stood up, my knees were stiff from the cold ground, and my face was wet in the way it gets when you've been crying without quite noticing that you've started. I walked back to my car slowly. A woman a few rows over was tending to another plot, and she looked up as I passed and gave me a small nod. Boy, the particular kind that people in cemeteries give each other, the kind that says, "I understand why you're here, and I'm sorry for whatever brought you." I nodded back and kept walking. 3 years. That was what my brother had taken from me. 3 years of my life, a relationship I had believed in, a career I had spent years building, a version of my future that I would never fully get back. He was going to spend the next 9 years inside a facility not unlike the one I had just left. I didn't feel satisfaction about that. I didn't feel much of anything about it anymore, which I think is closer to what peace actually feels like than most people expect. My grandfather used to say the truth didn't always come out fast, but it always came out complete. He had believed that enough to stake his last act on it. He had prepared for the worst and trusted that something would carry it forward. Dr. Callahan had carried it. A photocopied page from a stranger's envelope had started the thread. And somewhere in a storage warehouse, inside a hollow book in the 4th cardboard box, the rest had been waiting. He had been, right. I drove home on the highway with the windows cracked just enough to let the cold November air move through the car, and I let myself think about the next year. Not some abstract future 10 years out, just the next season, the next reasonable thing to do. The fund, the legal aid office that had already sent me 3 referral cases, the possibility of going back to work, or maybe something different, maybe something I hadn't considered before all of this started. That felt like enough to build from. My grandfather had spent 40 years building something out of nothing, one property at a time, in a city that didn't hand anything to anyone. He had done it with patience and with the belief that things accumulated over time if you kept showing up. I was 34 years old, and I had the rest of my life still in front of me. The people who had tried to take it apart had failed at the most important part. They had taken years. They had not taken what I was going to do with the ones that remained. I kept the windows open the whole drive back, even when the cold became uncomfortable. I wanted to feel it. I wanted to remember what it felt like to be moving forward and choosing, for the first time in a long time, exactly where I was going.